Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, a scientist walks into a bar and loses her research job for talking about it on stage at open mic nights. But in doing so, Sarah Adelman gained a whole new career melding comedy with science communication. Sarah, a comic, screenwriter, and former public health researcher, joins me to talk about her entry into stand-up comedy and her work teaching researchers around the country how the basic principles of comedy can help them become better communicators, particularly around topics that might be complicated or fraught. Let's listen. Sarah Adelman, welcome to Public Health on Call. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm good, Lindsay. How are you?
Good. So today we might laugh a little bit during this podcast.
I hope so. Otherwise, I should lose my job.
So we're going to talk about comedy and public health and misinformation. This is not really a topic that we've covered on the podcast before, but to back up just a little bit, would you tell folks about you?
Absolutely. My name is Sarah. I'm a stand-up comedian, born and raised New Yorker. That was not always the plan. I was a really straight A student, very obsessed with school. I wanted academia to be my life. So I went to Dartmouth for undergrad. I thought being a writer could be something cool or interesting. I'd been a huge fan of David Sedaris, the comedy writer. And I just interviewed a bunch of alums who were writers and professors and stuff. And it just seemed like there was not an actual career there. So I remember meeting with a career counselor my sophomore year of college, and she was like, what else are you interested in? And I'd always been interested in women's health and childbirth. I'm the oldest of three, so saw my mom go through 2 pregnancies, and I just always been fascinated by that and newborn health and maternal health. So I started taking a bunch of medical sociology classes and really fell in love with that. I had thought to be involved in women's health, you had to go to medical school, and I hated biochem. So I did not think that medical school would be for me. But then I discovered there's something called research, which I had never even heard of. I thought the only people doing research were also clinicians. I didn't realize that you could just have a career in research. So I wrote a senior thesis. I loved doing my own independent study. So I went to graduate school. I went to Columbia for my master's of public health, which I also really liked. I studied social determinants of health and population health there. So I got a little bit of everything, got a little biostats, got a little epi. Then I worked for 2 years at a prestigious unnamed medical center in New York. And there I worked under an amazing PI who was a fertility epidemiologist and got to do everything from centrifuging samples in the lab, doing wet bench lab work, to working with census data and doing biostats on a national level, and got to publish a bunch of awesome papers. At the time, I thought my job was funny. I was working primarily at a sperm bank at the hospital studying microplastics and sperm quality in New York men. And no one on my job thought that was funny. So I started doing stand-up comedy open mics at night as sort of this outlet. And then I completely fell in love with stand-up. I had always secretly wanted to be a stand-up comedian, and I thought everyone else secretly wanted to be a stand-up comedian. And the older I got, the more I realized only I have that dream. A lot of people do not want to do that. So I started going to these mics, and the mics turned into shows, and the shows turned into more shows, and I became totally addicted to comedy. And it was really cool to be able to bring the scientific perspective to stand-up. And it had a lot in common as well. A joke is really, writing a hypothesis, seeing something about the world, seeing if it lands, iterating on it. It reminded me a lot of my quote unquote day job. Eventually did get fired for doing stand-up comedy about my job, which that's on me. They got my butt on that. But that was 2.5 years ago. So I'm totally fine and I'm recovered. And since then have kind of just been decided, I kind of want to make a career for myself, in between rigid academia and comedy. So now I do stand-up every night, but my quote unquote day job now is I give lectures and teach workshops about how to use skills from stand-up comedy and screenwriting to be a better science communicator. Because I truly believe that like charisma can be taught, being funny can be taught, and there's so many skills from stand-up that can be applied to science communication. And science is doing amazing work, but we're not training scientists on how to be communicators, just like we don't teach bedside manner in medical school. And these are like those like quote unquote soft skills. I've said quote unquote like 10 times now, that I want to empower scientists to be able to take their work outside of the lab.
Okay, so wait, we got to back up a minute here.
Okay, totally.
Because you glossed over part of the story that I think people need to hear. You were working at a sperm bank,
Yes.
and at night you were doing stand-up comedy. And
Yes.
eventually someone says, oh, by the way, Sarah's like telling jokes about our lab, and you get fired.
That's correct.
So, okay. So lesson learned there. So we'll tell
Yes.
the folks at home, like maybe figure out like where the boundaries are with your
Figure out
job.
the boundaries are. Maybe use a stage name. Maybe take it off your LinkedIn where you work. Don't have everything like on, I definitely learned my lesson. And I think I was also, somewhat used as an example because I know that there have been a lot of problems of medical staff making videos in labs or like accidentally with like PHI and stuff like that. So I think everyone should be able to do whatever they want to do outside of work. But I think in hindsight, I definitely should have been more careful and covered my bases. And while I never like violated HIPAA or like did anything illegal, I recognize now it was probably playing with fire.
So maybe just separate those out a little bit more, have some strong
Separate them
boundaries.
out. Yes.
Okay, so now let's go on to the other thing you said that I want to dig into here a little bit here. So you're saying that comedy is very similar to science. Talk through that.
I think it's so similar. I think that a lot of people think that like, oh, a joke, it just comes to you and it's inspiration and then it's done and it's out in the world. Comedy is the hardest thing in the entire world. And I had a full career in academia, and I can say that writing a joke is harder than any paper that I ever published, any experiment that I ever did, because there's so many variables at play, just like in science, The same way that we would come up both with research questions in my lab, we would look for things that created friction, that didn't really make sense. If this is true, then why isn't that true? Like coming up with hypotheses. That's very similar to how I come up with jokes and material. I'll look for friction in my life, something that I want to usually complain about. And then I'll be like, okay, why is that causing me to be annoyed? Or why is that something that I want to shine a light on? And then I'll do my like literature review the same way I would when I would write a paper. And I kind of investigate that. I ask people what they think about it. I do research online. I try to figure out like what is the pebble in my shoe about that topic. And then I'll try it on stage. And I will continue to iterate on it the same way that you do in science. You run multiple experiments. Like I have a big audition on Friday and you only have 6 minutes to do your best set for the industry. And these are jokes that I've been working on for years that are now, I feel like, polished through like the rock tumbler of thousands of shows. The same way that in order to prove something in science, you have to do an experiment so many times. You have to have the right sample size. You have to know that something works. And I really like the data collection of figuring out, what jokes work and in what settings do jokes not work. And now that I've been doing comedy for almost 5 years, I have enough jokes in my repertoire. Or if I'm doing stand-up and I can tell like, oh, these jokes are not working. I can like look at the crowd and look at that data. And I'm like, oh, okay, everyone here is very old. Like everyone in this crowd is like over 60. So I probably shouldn't be doing these jokes with these references. I'm going to like pull something else out of my hat. And so it's just kind of like constant analysis, I guess, if that makes sense.
Totally. So you've also been a big advocate about using science to combat misinformation. So let's talk about that.
Definitely. I think that, okay, first of all, I want to say that a lot of people have a negative view of science because they didn't do well in science in school. And I think a lot of people are walking around carrying like the feeling of flunking a chem test or a bio test in school. So I think that makes people sort of emotional when they come up with science. People don't like to feel stupid, especially when they're being lectured by someone in a white lab coat representing the ivory tower. I also think that science, while it's very factual, it makes us emotional. Like even looking at, masking and COVID, I feel like, with the 1918 flu epidemic, I feel like everyone just masked because that's what you were supposed to do. And then in COVID, it became emotional and it became political, and wearing a mask turned into like, who am I as a person? Like, what do my values mean? So science can make us really emotional, even though it should just be science, but it's not. And humor is also an emotion. So I think when people are reacting emotionally to science information and they want to engage with misinformation, sometimes it doesn't make sense to meet that with just facts. It makes sense to meet it with emotion. So, for example, there's this Onion video that I really like. The Onion is this great satirical newspaper that's been around forever. And they have this video on climate change, this great satirization where it says something like, "You will not imagine the number of resources it took to pull off the global hoax of climate change. Like, it took so long to convince every scientist in the entire world to lie to you about climate change." This video, when it was shown to people who, this is like a study, I think from 2018, people who did not believe in climate change and did not believe that it was serious, this video was far more effective at changing people's minds to believe that climate change is a real and serious issue compared to just like a straight video showing you sad photos of polar bears. I think that humor can be a big inroad to connection because information is all about connection and communication is about connection. And if you're able to make someone laugh, physiologically, it can give you like dopamine and make you relax and drop your shoulders and be like, look, we're just like here hanging out. It's fine. It can also be just a different way to take in information. I always say that comedy and humor generally, whether that's storytelling or metaphors or just being generally warm, can disrupt, disarm, and diffuse. So it can like disrupt your traditional ways of thinking, like you go into you don't want to vaccinate your kids because you've read a bunch of scary articles on Facebook and you think that your doctor is going to say, whatever. But if they're able to meet you with a joke or warmth or storytelling or humor in some way, studies have shown that that's much more effective at reducing vaccine hesitancy than just lecturing someone. And it can disarm you when you're feeling emotional, like our scientific views, like those feel like values to us. And yeah, it can just disrupt like those traditional patterns of thinking. So this is all to say, I think that when dealing with misinformation, it makes us very emotional. And comedy is another great way to make us emotional. So meeting emotion with emotion can be a much better way to understand where someone is coming from, make them feel safe, make them feel heard, and show like, I'm not a threat. I'm not here to like make you feel stupid or take offense. Like, I'm joking with you. I know what's up. Read of the situation. Let's just like meet human to human.
So where do you draw the line? I mean, obviously we've already talked about, you should have some boundaries between your day job and whatever you do outside of your day job. But where do you draw the line in terms of like, not joking around? How do you know when humor maybe has gone too far or is not appropriate for a situation?
Definitely. I think when I get this question every time I do a talk, because I think people think I'm saying like, when you show up at a like cancer conference, open with a hard joke. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I think that humor is a spectrum, just like a lot of things. It goes from everything from telling a story that is moving and has a personal touch to like a hard setup punchline, like Nate Bargatze joke. And there's a lot in between there. So I think there's two rules of thumb. The first is know your audience, and the second is know yourself. Like, if you don't think that you as a speaker either have the skills yet of comedic timing or knowing the vibe, or have written such a good joke that the joke might flop, because it is taking a big risk, maybe don't open guns blazing going out with a joke. And the same for knowing the audience. Like if you are speaking at a childhood leukemia conference, it's probably not the best place to like open with like a bit I think that if you want to make a joke and the subject matter is difficult, I think doing something self-deprecating is always the best way to go. People trust, it sort of has an opposite effect. I think a lot of people, especially if they're not used to comedy, they think like, oh, if I make fun of how I look or how I sound or the way that I am, it will make everyone trust me less. But I've seen across every stand-up comedian who always makes fun of themselves, whether it's how they look or present or whatever, it gives the audience the feeling of like, oh, I see what you see. Like, we're clued in, we're on the same wavelength. Like if you look like a mad, crazy scientist and you get on stage to give a keynote, like it's funny and makes everyone like you more if you make a little self-deprecating joke about it. I would also say in terms, if you're questioning like, does this cross the line? It probably does. That was like the rule of thumb with my high school uniform. Like if you think your skirt is too short, it's probably too short. I think the same with humor. If you're questioning it, maybe tone it back and run it by some people. But, there have been a lot of studies that show that comedy makes us seem more trustworthy and more interesting. And we know across all disciplines that if you enjoy listening to information, you're going to remember it more and it's going to stick with you more. So I think looking at the different types of jokes that you can make. And sometimes just getting a chuckle is great. You don't need everyone like Madison Square Garden, like laughing their butts off.
So I know, we've heard from a lot of scientists that, and you mentioned, people don't always get training in how to talk about their work. And you've mentioned some great tips here also for people that are thinking about how can they sort of warm into this kind of thing. But, what sort of early tips do you have for someone that might be newer in their career and they're really navigating first just getting like the right words together? How do you then layer on, the skill of comedy?
Well, the first I would say that I think a lot of people think that comedy is something you are born with. That is definitely not true. Like you look at any comedian when they first started versus 20 years into their career, like anything, it's a skill and practicing will make you better. And I'm not saying that every scientist should start going to open mics after work, but even something like, I know a lot of labs have an improv team come in like once a year and they learn skills like that. Or, you give a best man speech at a wedding. Like anytime that you can just practice getting in front of people and getting comfortable with that and rewiring stage fright as excitement and anticipation, I think will be helpful. I would say the first thing is to get that base layer down of simply communicating your science before you move into the funny. Because if you're just trying to make jokes, but you haven't really gotten the knack of how to communicate your science, especially with the lay public, the jokes probably will not land as well. And all my best jokes also I write. I don't like sit down and like write jokes like on a pen and paper at a cafe. The majority of my jokes, and certainly my best jokes, are things that I've said that have made my friends laugh, and then I write down exactly what I said and then try it on stage. So if you're trying to, workshop jokes for a TED Talk or a keynote or dissertation defense, I think trying to make your science friends laugh when giving it and then recording it and listening back, that can be really helpful. But I would say, first of all, especially when you're communicating with the lay public, I think a lot of people's first instinct is to say, how can I sound as educated and prestigious as possible? But there's a great study I always quote that looked at, I think, like 20,000 papers. And they found that across the board, the more jargon that you used in your title and your abstract, the lower number of citations that your paper got. So even among other academics, kind of getting drowned in the jargon and the overly scientific stuff, that's not helping anyone. It's not helping the lay public, and it's not even helping your peers. So I would say trying to communicate with people in a way where you're explaining it almost to like an alien or your friend or someone that you want to understand but might not have any training in that field, I think is a good place to start. And then, you can continue building up and just thinking to yourself, be like, okay, if I have a lot of like empathy for my crowd and they don't understand anything about this topic, what would be an interesting inroad? Like, what's a metaphor that I can use to explain, what this cell is doing about, how can I use a metaphor like plumbing or cars or traffic? Like, what's something that I can find a point of connection? And then I would also say the last thing is the more excited you are as the speaker, the more excited everyone else is going to be to listen to you. Like, we delight in other people's delight. And speaking and being in an audience is an energy exchange thing. Like there's a reason that we laugh so much more when we see comedy live than if we watch it on television. Like being around other people, having that energy, it's electric and it's contagious. So if you get on stage and you're just like, hey guys, like here, I'm going to talk to you about fruit flies. Everyone's like, okay, why would I care about this? But if you're like, what's up, New York? It's fruit fly time. Like I'm not saying, go that intense, but your excitement will create their excitement.
Why not go that intense?
Why not? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Disrespect to the fruit fly community. Yeah. Shout out my fruit flies. But yeah, I would say that the more excited you are, the more excited they are. But start with the pure communication before you move into comedy communication. And to also study, something I say a lot in my lecture is every book, novel, TV show, movie that you have loved has followed like the 3-act structure going back to Aristotle's Poetics of there's this introduction that hooks you, then there's this inciting incident, then there's this second act where all the obstacles are happening, and then there's this climax in the third act, and then there's this resolution and denouement. And that's how you tell a great story. So how can you, when you're giving a talk, open with something interesting, hook them, give them, a personal anecdote. Like people love to know what, like you've dedicated your life to fruit flies. Amazing. Why? Like what got you into that? Like be personal, be vulnerable, open up a little bit, then introduce the problem and show everything you did to solve it. And then have this great climax of your findings. And then you wrap it up. Movies are just like scientific papers. It's all 3 acts.
Well, I mean, I certainly would love to see you give a presentation on anything scientific, but we really appreciate all the work that you're doing to make science more accessible, more welcoming. Sarah Adelman, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call.
Thank you so much. Science is cool and everyone should be into it.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.